Before the bomb went off, the United States Army had already written down what it was going to say about it. There were 2 pieces of paper. The first was short. It explained that a remotely located ammunition magazine containing a considerable amount of high explosive and pyrotechnics had exploded. It stated that there was no loss of life or injury to anyone, and that the property damage outside the magazine itself was negligible. The second said all of that, and then added one more sentence. Weather conditions affecting the content of gas shells exploded by the blast may make it desirable for the Army to evacuate temporarily a few civilians from their homes. 2 versions of the same untruth, waiting in a drawer to find out which one the morning would require. At that point, the weapon had not been fired. The device was still being raised up a steel tower in a stretch of southern New Mexico desert that Spanish travelers had named the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, roughly 2 centuries before anyone thought to put a bomb in it. So the Army knew what it would say about the largest explosion anyone had ever made, before that explosion existed. That is not a theory, and it is not an interpretation. Both documents survive. So does the memorandum from the officer who was ordered to stand by with trucks and tents in case the second version turned out to be the one they needed. The file opens, in other words, on a page dated before the event it describes. And here is the detail that gets missed every time this story is told. Look at what the second release actually promises. It is a sentence about people the Army might move. Read both documents end to end in the language the Army chose for them, and there is not one word anywhere about the people it would decide to leave exactly where they were. Tens of thousands of them, under something that kept coming down for days. July 16th, 1945. 29 minutes and 45 seconds past 5 in the morning, mountain wartime, in Socorro County, New Mexico. The device sat on a 100-foot steel tower in open desert. The yield is still argued over 80 years later. The long-standing Los Alamos figure is about 21 kilotons, and a reassessment published in 2021 put it closer to 25. What that means on the ground is simpler. For a fraction of a second, the New Mexico desert held the brightest thing that had ever existed on the surface of the earth. Almost every account of that morning is told from inside the bunkers. Oppenheimer, Bainbridge, Fermi dropping his scraps of paper. Those men had goggles, welding glass, a countdown, and a rough idea of what they were about to see. Nobody else did. The light reached ranch houses and sheep camps and small towns across southern New Mexico with no warning of any kind. A woman in Alamogordo thought the sun had come up twice. Windows rattled 100 miles out. People awake at that hour watched the sky go white and then orange, and had no word for it, because there was no word for it yet. Now hold that against the first line of the Army's press release. Not the ammunition sentence, the line before it, the one that gets cut when the document is quoted. Several inquiries have been received concerning a heavy explosion which occurred on the Alamogordo Air Base reservation this morning. Inquiries had been received. The population had already seen it, already felt it, and was already on the telephone asking what it was. The cover story was not pushed out into an empty silence. It was an answer handed to people who had every right to ask the question. And it was false. The scale of who was asking matters. Nearly 500,000 people were living within 150 miles of that tower, a figure built from the 1940 census, and it takes in more than half the population of the state. Tens of thousands lived within 50 miles. The Downwinders' own organization has identified ranching families as close as 12 miles, and the National Park Service puts the nearest at 13. None of them were told, none of them were moved, and the light, which is the part everybody remembers, was not the part that hurt them. What hurt them arrived quietly, and it arrived late. It came down as warm white flakes, not a blast, a snowfall in the middle of July for days. One of the men it fell on described it. MC Ratliff ran goats at Hot Canyon, about 20 miles northeast of the tower. When a Los Alamos doctor came out to see him that November, Ratliff said the ground and the fence posts had the appearance of being covered with light snow, or of being frosted, for several days after the shot. Why that mattered so much in 1945 comes down to how those families lived, and the National Park Service has been direct about it. Rural New Mexicans in that period largely had no running water. They caught rain off their roofs, stored it in cisterns, and drank it. They grew their food in that soil, kept their own animals, and drank milk from their own cows. The National Cancer Institute would later determine that fresh cow's milk delivered the single largest internal dose to the thyroid. The fallout did not have to be breathed in to do harm. It only had to land on a roof. 40 to 50 miles southeast, near Ruidoso, an instructor named Karma Dean was running a summer dance camp for girls. About a dozen of them were asleep in bunks when the shock threw the ones on top onto the floor. One of them was 13 years old, and her name was Barbara Kent. She told the story publicly in 2015 to a reporter for the Santa Fe New Mexican. It was July, she said, and it was snowing, and yet it was real warm. The girls went outside and played in it, put it on their hands, rubbed it on their faces. In her later telling, she added the detail that stayed with her, that instead of being cold like snow, it was hot. In other accounts, she described the girls catching it on their tongues. She also said that most of those girls did not live to be 40. That claim has to be handled carefully, because the retellings do not agree. Some say 2 of the 12 lived past 40. Others say she was the only one left by 30. What can be said is what she said as her own recollection, that the versions differ, and that nobody ever ran the study that could have settled it. There is one witness here that cannot be accused of misremembering, and it left a paper trail. The cattle. Across the Tularosa Basin, somewhere between 500 and 600 head, showed what the Army's own data called signs of beta ray damage. Lesions on the skin, hair falling out in patches, the animals otherwise appearing normal. The Army bought fewer than 100 of the worst affected and shipped most of them to Oak Ridge in Tennessee for study. The last, a cow the staff there called Granny, lived until she was put down in 1964. The Army had a name for what the cattle had, beta burns, which means that within weeks of the test somebody had worked out what the flakes were and what they did to living skin, and had gone into the basin to document it. They were documenting cows. The bulletin went out on July the 16th in the name of Colonel William O. Erickson, commanding officer of the Alamogordo Army Air Base. It survives in the official record of the Potsdam Conference, which is how it can be quoted with confidence today. 4 sentences: an ammunition magazine, high explosive, and pyrotechnics. No loss of life or injury to anyone. And the line about gas shells and the possible temporary evacuation of a few civilians. Here is what almost nobody knows about that document. It was the mildest of a set. The releases were drafted by William L. Lawrence, a science reporter for the New York Times who had been brought inside the Manhattan Project and who was standing in the desert that morning watching. Lawrence wrote versions in advance to cover a range of outcomes. The one that ran was the best case. Further down the stack were versions covering serious damage to the surrounding communities, versions covering the evacuation of nearby residents, and one with a space left blank for the names of the dead. Lawrence knew, standing there, that if that last page were ever used, it would be his own obituary. So the drawer did not hold a lie about an ammunition dump. It held a graded menu of explanations, running from an accident with no casualties to a mass fatality event with a gap, where the names would go. On the morning of the 16th, the Army selected from it. The evacuation was not hypothetical either. It was staffed. Major T.O. Palmer had 140 enlisted men and 4 officers under him, with 140 vehicles. They carried tents, water, rations, coffee, sugar, and milk, enough for roughly 450 people for 2 days. Their headquarters was near Bingham, in the middle of the area most likely to need them. Their job was to go into the basin and take civilians out of it. At about 1 in the afternoon, on July 16th, 7.5 hours after the shot, once the possibility of what the record calls serious contamination was judged to have passed, the detachment was released from duty. The fallout was still coming down. Ratliff would watch it frost his fence posts for days. Read that sequence once more in order, because the sequence is the whole thing. The Army wrote a document saying it might have to evacuate civilians. It assembled a unit to do exactly that, provisioned it with milk for 450 people, and positioned it correctly. Then it stood the unit down while the material was still falling on the houses that unit had been built to empty. No document has ever surfaced explaining that decision. What does exist is a document written a month earlier, warning that this was going to happen. June 16th, 1945, 30 days before the test. 2 physicists on the project, Joseph Hirschfelder and John McGee, wrote to Kenneth Bainbridge, the man running Trinity, about the danger from active material falling out of the cloud. Their warning, in their own words, was of a definite danger of dust containing active material and fission products falling on towns near Trinity and necessitating their evacuation. They put a number on it. Individuals could receive something like 22 Roentgens. The safety standard in force at the time was 1/10 of 1 Roentgen. They were describing a dose more than 100 times the limit, landing on towns in writing a month out. Honesty requires one more line here because a critic will find it otherwise. On July 6th, the same two men revised that estimate downward, arguing the active material might be less by a factor of somewhere between 2 and 10. The revision lowered a number. It did not withdraw the danger, and it did not disband the evacuation detachment, still standing by 10 days later with milk in the trucks. Everything that followed happened with that warning already in the file. Then the measurements came back. The rat lifts at Hot Canyon had been missed entirely in the pre-test surveys. Nobody knew they were there. A pair of grandparents and their grandson, and by the calculations of the project's own medical director, Louis Hempelmann, they received an estimated 47 Roentgens of gamma radiation in the 2 weeks after the shot, against what that same report called an allowable limit of 1.4. 47 against 1.4. 33 times the ceiling the Army had set for itself. And then there is the sentence in the 1947 Health Physics report that is difficult to read twice. There was rain in this area on the night after the shot, which means the report says that some of the activity was carried into their drinking water and may have been drunk on the following day and thereafter. The Army worked out that the fallout had gone into a family's drinking water, wrote it down, filed the report. Los Alamos staff did come out to the affected families afterward and took samples of the drinking water. As far as the record shows, not one of them told the Ratlifts what the risk was, or why men from a laboratory 200 miles away were interested in a goat rancher's cistern. Somebody should have said something. Nobody did. The National Park Service now states the underlying reason in a single sentence on its own website. Scientists, it says, did not collect any data about civilian exposure, concerned that this might alarm the public. Which brings this chapter to the line that makes every conspiracy theory about Trinity unnecessary. Louis Hempelmann was the physician responsible for the health of everyone connected to this test. Years afterward, describing what had happened to the people of the Tularosa Basin, he said this: "A few people were probably overexposed, but they couldn't prove it and we couldn't prove it, so we just assumed we got away with it. Not a leak, not a rumour, not an accusation from anyone with a grievance." That is the man in charge, describing his own reasoning, in his own words, in the file. The people underneath it would not learn any of this for decades. And the first outsider to notice was not a doctor, and was nowhere near New Mexico. In Rochester, New York, the Eastman Kodak Company began finding a defect in its most sensitive product. Sheets of X-ray film were coming out of storage fogged, in small dark spots, after about 2 weeks in the packaging. The physicist who ran it down was Julian H. Webb of the Kodak Research Laboratories. Webb worked backward through the supply chain and found the contamination was not in the film. It was in the strawboard used to pack it from a mill at Vincennes, Indiana on the Wabash River, and he narrowed it to a single production run. That run of strawboard had been manufactured on August 6, 1945. Webb measured the energy of the radiation and how fast it decayed, burned the material to ash, and put the ash through radiochemical analysis. The contaminant was a rare earth with a half-life of about 30 days, consistent with the isotope cerium-141. Not natural, a fission product. The mill drew its process water from the river, and the river had carried it down out of the weather. 800 miles southwest, 3 weeks earlier, somebody had set off an atomic bomb. Webb published in Physical Review on the 1st of August 1949, 4 years after he found it, because for most of that time he was not permitted to say so. One correction is worth making out loud, because it has been repeated for decades. The packaging was strawboard, not corn husks. That detail belongs to a different decade and a different argument, and it keeps getting dragged into this one. A film company in upstate New York discovered the fallout from Trinity by accident, from damaged inventory, and reverse-engineered a nuclear test out of a spoiled batch of cardboard. Nobody warned Kodak because nobody was warning anybody at all. Now move forward 6 years, because what comes next is a separate story and only lands if it stays separate. January 1951. Operation Ranger, the first nuclear tests at the Nevada test site. Snow fell on Rochester, and the Geiger counters at the Kodak plant read 25 times above normal. This time, Kodak did not investigate quietly. It complained and it threatened to sue. The Atomic Energy Commission agreed to give the company advance information about future tests, then extended the arrangement across the photographic industry, supplying manufacturers with maps and forecasts of where contamination was expected to fall. In 1945, the film industry was a victim that stumbled onto the truth years late. In 1951, it was a complainant that walked away with a warning system. The arrangement stayed quiet for more than 40 years. When it surfaced at a Senate hearing on the 1st of October 1997, Senator Tom Harkin put the obvious question on the record. Where, he asked, were the maps for the dairy farmers? Where were the warnings to the parents of children in these areas? Nobody had an answer then either. There is a practical reason the United States could go on saying that nothing had happened to the people of the Tularosa Basin. New Mexico had no cancer registry of any kind until 1966, and the one that started then covered only Albuquerque and the north-central part of the state. It did not cover the whole state until 1969. 24 years passed between the test and any instrument capable of counting what it did. The silence in the data was not evidence that nothing happened. It was the result of never building the thing that would have noticed. So the community counted itself. The Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium was founded in 2005 by Tina Cordovar and the late Fred Tyler. Nuevo Mexicano and ranching families, many descended from people who had held that ground for generations, going door to door with paper health surveys, in the villages, at church, at funerals, because nobody else was going to come and ask. In 2017, they surveyed 501 people across Socorro and Otero counties. Close to 20% reported thyroid disease, more than a quarter reported cancer. Those are self-reported figures gathered by volunteers rather than a controlled study, and the consortium has never claimed otherwise. By 2025, Cordova had collected more than 1,000. The organization's own summary is the sharpest sentence written about any of this. No major health study by the United States government, or by any other entity, has ever been focused on the people living downwind and downstream of the world's first atmospheric nuclear test. The affected area takes in the Mescalero Apache Reservation, whose people were counted in none of it either. The federal government did eventually produce a number. The National Cancer Institute published a dose reconstruction in the journal Health Physics in October of 2020. Its data suggested that perhaps several hundred cancers, primarily thyroid, had already occurred in the 75 years since the test, with up to roughly 1,000 cases across all cancer types projected over a lifetime. What that study says about itself matters as much as the number. The Institute stated that there is great uncertainty in the estimates, that no firm estimates can be established, and that with the available data it is not possible to definitively identify the specific individuals whose cancers might be due to the exposure. So the National Cancer Institute did not prove that Trinity gave any particular person cancer, and it said so plainly. What it did was put a shape and a scale on a harm the government had spent 75 years declining to measure. That distinction is worth protecting, because these families have been accused of exaggerating for most of a century, and the accurate ground is the strongest ground they have, which brings this to the law. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was signed on October 15, 1990. It paid downwinders in 22 rural counties of Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, the people who had lived under the Nevada test site, $50,000 each. On-site participants got $75,000. New Mexico was not included, not one county of it. And the Trinity site near Alamogordo is explicitly named in that same law as a qualifying location for on-site participants. Set those two facts beside each other and leave them there. A man who travelled to the Jornada del Muerto in July of 1945 in order to watch the test, from a bunker 20 miles out, wearing goggles, knowing exactly what was coming, could file a claim. A family living 12 miles from the tower who had not been told, not been moved and not been asked, could not. No surviving document explains that decision, so nothing here will invent one. The two facts are enough. Then the program ran out. The authority behind it expired in June of 2024. 34 years after it was written, it closed without the people of the Tularosa Basin ever having been eligible for a single day of it. On the 4th of July 2025, they became eligible. The Act was reauthorized and expanded under Public Law 119/21. The entire state of New Mexico is now covered. 80 years after the tower, it is worth saying exactly what that means. $100,000 paid one time, with claims to be filed by the 31st of December 2027. And it does not pay for treatment, which needs stating carefully, because the law never did. The bills that would have added ongoing health coverage did not pass. What arrived after 80 years was the payment on its own. Both halves of that are true. It is a victory, and Tina Cordova gave 20 years of her life to it, which is not how these stories usually end. It is also 80 years late, one payment set against generations of medical bills, and most of the people it was owed to did not live to file for it. Go back to the drawer. The 2 pages are still in the record exactly as they were written before the tower went up, and the sentence on the second one reads differently now. Weather conditions affecting the content of gas shells exploded by the blast may make it desirable for the Army to evacuate temporarily a few civilians from their homes. Every word of that turned out to be accurate. Weather conditions did make it desirable. It was desirable on the night of the 16th, when the rain came through Hot Canyon and into the Ratliff's cistern, and for all the days the flakes went on frosting the fence posts. The Army had the men, the trucks, the tents, and the milk parked near Bingham, waiting for an order that never came. The document was not wrong about what would be necessary. It was wrong about what would be done, and this file is complete, which is the strange part. Every plate numbered, every dose calculated, every Röntgen entered in a column with a date beside it. The paperwork on this event is close to immaculate. The only thing it never recorded is the name of a single person it fell on. Those names exist. They were kept in the basin, in kitchens and parish registers, and on paper surveys, carried house to house by a woman who would not stop asking. Nobody was counting them, so they counted themselves. The file closes here, the counting does not.